Please, somebody. My daughter can't breathe right. 5 women, soaked church dresses clinging to their backs, mascara running in black rivers down their faces. Behind them, a stalled minivan with its hood up, steam hissing into the rain. Behind that, 4 porches with their lights, switched off on purpose. Marsh, $71.38 in a coffee can. A foreclosure letter folded so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. Sir, we knocked everywhere on this street. People saw us coming and locked their doors. My little girl's wheezing. How bad, asthma, and we left her inhaler at the church. She needs cool air and water now. Odell looked past the woman's shoulder at his porch light, then back at her face, rain running off her chin like she'd been crying for an hour before she ever knocked on his door. He didn't ask what church. He didn't ask why 5 women and 1 sick child were stranded on Cobb Lane at 10 o'clock at night in their Sunday best. Vesta was already behind him in the doorway, dish towel forgotten in her hand. Get that child in here, Odell. I don't care what time it is. One of the younger women started crying harder. Ma'am, 4 houses already shut their blinds on us. Vesta just waved her hand like she was swatting a fly. 4 houses lost, baby. Bring her to the kitchen table. We got a fan back there. 6 days later, an entire gospel choir bus would idle in that same gravel driveway, and the name Marsh would be spoken in 3 states the way folks speak a name they trust with their whole chest. 2 days before 5 strangers showed up soaked and shaking on his porch, Odell Marsh had done what he'd done every morning for 40 years. He flipped the sign on the door of his little radio repair shop at 6 a.m., touched the edge of a photograph tacked above the workbench. His father in coveralls, squinting into the sun outside this same building back when it sold tube radios instead of fixing them, and said, soft as breath, "Morning, Pop." Then he crossed the gravel to the house behind the shop to find his wife. Vesta was already up, hair-wrapped, the radio on low-playing gospel, out of the church station, 2 counties over. She had grits going, and the good skillet out for eggs. "Morning, old man. Morning, woman who married a fool. Sleep all right? Hips acting up again. I know. Heard you cussing at it around 4. She set a plate down without looking at him, the way you do when you've set 10,000 plates down for the same person, and your hands have the route memorized better than your eyes do. They'd been doing this since 1981. 41 years. The Marsh place sat at the dead end of Cobb Lane, outside a little town called Pruitt's Crossing, Georgia. 2 buildings. A brick shop with Marsh Radio and electronics painted on the window in letters. Odell had repainted himself every 5 years since his father died, and behind it a wood frame house with a tin roof that sang when it rained. A gravel path connected the 2, and every single day at noon, rain or shine, Odell and Vesta ate lunch standing at that workbench together. 2 paper plates, 2 glasses of sweet tea, 41 years of the same 15 minutes. It was a small life, a quiet one. Nobody outside Pruitt's Crossing had ever heard the name Marsh, and that had always suited Odell fine. He fixed radios, old amplifiers, the occasional television nobody else in 3 counties knew how to open up anymore. People brought him things their grandfathers had owned. He brought those things back to life. It wasn't much of a living anymore. Everybody just threw broken things away now, bought new ones shipped to their door. But it had been enough until it wasn't. The letter had sat on the workbench for 6 weeks. Odell kept turning it face down under a coffee mug. Vesta kept pretending she didn't notice him turn it face down. The bank wanted the back payments by the 15th, or they'd start proceedings on the shop and the house both, since Odell, 20 years back in a moment of pride he now regretted bitterly, had used the house as collateral to expand the shop's old equipment. He counted the coffee can that morning before the rain started, $38, a 10, a few 5s, the rest in 1s and change. He'd been saving toward a new soldering rig. He closed the can and looked down at his hands, the knuckles swollen with 40 years of solder burns and copper wire. Hands that had brought 3,000 silent radios back to voice. Hands that had once held a stranger's newborn, while the stranger's wife screamed in the back of a stalled car on this very road in a snowstorm in 1996. Hands that had buried his mother and his father and, 11 years ago, his only son, Marcus, who never made it home from a tour he shouldn't have had to take a second time. These hands were now, it seemed, going to have to hand over the keys to everything his father built. He hadn't told Vesta the number yet. She knew. She'd known longer than he had, probably, the way she always seemed to know things before he said them out loud. But neither of them had managed to say the word foreclosure to each other directly, not once, in 6 weeks. They just kept living the days, one after another, the way you keep walking, even when you already know the bridge is out somewhere ahead. The big chain electronics store that had opened off the interstate 18 months back didn't fix anything. They just sold you new. But it had still managed to bleed away most of what little business Pruitt's Crossing had left for a man like Odell. There was a sign at the four-way stop in town now, with a cartoon mascot on it, bright and cheerful, promising you'd never need a repairman again. Odell had stood in front of that sign once, just looking at it, the way you look at a thing that's slowly killing something you love without ever once raising its voice. It was on a Thursday night in October, the rain coming down sideways off a storm that had been building over the Chattahoochee all afternoon, that the minivan rolled to a stop 200 yards short of the marsh driveway and died there, hazards blinking weak and then not at all. The 5 women had been coming back from a revival 3 counties over, sisters and cousins from the same small church, 2 of them carrying a child each, a boy of about 8 asleep against his mother's shoulder, and a girl of 6, Talia, whose chest had begun to whistle on the drive home in a way her mother, Bernice, knew too well. They'd tried 4 houses on Cobb Lane already. At the first house, a man had come to the door, taken one look at 5 black women standing in the rain at night, and said through the chained gap, "Can't help you," before the door clicked shut. At the second house, the porch light had gone out the second they stepped onto the gravel, like somebody inside had been watching and waiting with a finger on the switch. At the third, a dog had been let loose at the fence line, barking until they backed away. At the fourth, nobody answered at all, though Bernice swore she saw a curtain move. By the time they reached the marsh place at the end of the lane, Bernice wasn't asking for help so much as she was just trying to keep her voice from shaking apart entirely. Odell had heard the dog barking 3 houses down, the way sound travels strange on a wet night, and had stepped out onto his own porch with a flashlight just as the 5 women came up out of the dark, soaked through, one of them carrying a wheezing child. He didn't think about it. That was the thing nobody understood later, when they tried to make a saint out of him. There hadn't been a moment of decision at all. His body had simply turned toward Vesta's voice, and Vesta's voice had simply said, "Get that child in here." And the 2 of them had been moving in the same direction for so many decades that there was no daylight between thinking it and doing it. Vesta got Talia to the kitchen table, propped her up, turned the box fan on her face, found the old asthma inhaler tucked away in a kitchen drawer that had belonged to Marcus 30 years before, back when he was a wheezing boy himself. Expired now, but Vesta gave the girl 2 puffs anyway, because something was better than the cold panic in her mother's eyes, and within a few minutes the whistle in the child's chest had eased into something closer to ordinary breathing. Odell got on the shop phone, landline, the only kind that still worked reliably out past the county line in weather like this, and called Dr. Pruitt, who'd been the only doctor in town for 30 years, and who, despite the hour, said he'd meet them at his office in 15 minutes. No charge, just come. While Vesta wrapped a blanket around Talia's shoulders, Bernice sat down hard in a kitchen chair like her legs had simply stopped working, and put her face in her hands and said, muffled, "I'm sorry, we didn't know who else to try. 4 doors already said no tonight, and I didn't think a 5th would say yes." Vesta knelt in front of her, took both her hands. "Baby, look at me. This door says yes, every time. You hear me? This door says yes." Outside, the rain kept coming, and Odell stood at the window for a moment, looking at the minivan stalled in his driveway, the hazards finally giving out entirely, and felt something settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the bank letter sitting under the coffee mug 40 feet away. He went back out into it without his jacket, popped the hood, and started working by flashlight in the downpour, because that was simply the only thing in the world he knew how to do with his hands when somebody needed something fixed. It took him 40 minutes to find it. A corroded battery terminal, easy enough once you knew to look, but the kind of thing that strands a family on the worst night of their lives if nobody happens to know how to look. He cleaned the terminal with a wire brush from his own truck, tightened it down, and the van turned over on the second try. Dr. Pruitt met them at his office anyway, just to be safe, listened to Talia's lungs, said she'd be fine, gave Bernice a fresh inhaler from his sample drawer and his card, and told her to call anytime, day or night. By midnight, the 5 women and 2 children were back on the road toward home, an hour out, dry now, fed, because Vesta hadn't let a single one of them leave without a plate of cold cornbread and beans wrapped in foil. And changed in the particular quiet way people are changed when they've been turned away 4 times and then met with open arms on the 5th. Nobody in the Marsh house thought another thing about it. Odell went back to bed near 1 in the morning, hip aching worse than usual, and was up again at 6 to flip the sign on the shop door like always. What none of them knew, what nobody could have known, standing in that kitchen in the rain, was that Bernice Holloway directed the youth and gospel choir at Mount Zion Triumph, a church of nearly 900 members 2 counties over, the kind of congregation with a touring choir and a building fund and a pastor, Reverend Augustus Pell, who believed fiercely and loudly in the principle that kindness shown to the lowest among us ought to be returned tenfold to the giver. Bernice told the story at Wednesday night service 3 days later. She told it plainly, the way it had happened. 4 doors, then a 5th, an old man working in the rain with no jacket on, an old woman who called her baby before she knew her name. She told them about the foreclosure letter she'd glimpsed face down under a coffee mug on the workbench. While Odell worked outside, the bank's name printed clear enough at the top that she hadn't been able to unsee it. By Thursday morning, half the congregation knew the name Marsh. By Friday, Reverend Pell had made some calls to the bank in question, to a deacon who happened to sit on the county economic development board, to a cousin who ran a small construction outfit, and discovered that the amount standing between Odell Marsh and losing everything his father built in 1954 was in the scope of things, not actually fortune. It was just a fortune to a 71-year-old man with $38 in a coffee can. On Saturday morning, 6 days after the rain, Odell Marsh stepped outside to flip his sign at 6 a.m. and found his gravel driveway already half full. Not minivans this time. A church bus, white with Mount Zion's Triumph painted along the side in gold letters, and behind it a line of cars stretching back down Cobb Lane farther than he could see in the gray morning light, headlights glowing like a string of patient stars. Vesta came to the door behind him in her housecoat, hand pressed to her chest. Odell! Odell! What in the world? Bernice Holloway stepped off the bus first, Talia's small hand in hers, the girl waving like she recognized an old friend. Behind her came Reverend Pell, and behind him came nearly 40 members of the choir and congregation, carrying casserole dishes and toolboxes and folding tables, because somewhere in the calls that had gone out over the past 3 days, it had stopped being only about money and become about hands. Electricians among the membership, 2 contractors, a woman who did books for a living and offered on the spot to look over Odell's accounts for free, a retired roofer who took one look at the tin roof on the house and started measuring it before anybody had even said good morning properly. Reverend Pell found Odell standing frozen on his own porch and took both his hands, the way you'd take the hands of an old friend you hadn't seen in years. Mr. Marsh, I understand you've had some trouble with the bank. Odell, who had not cried at his own son's funeral in front of another living soul, felt his throat close entirely. Reverend, I don't take charity. This isn't charity, Mr. Marsh. Pell's voice was gentle, but it did not bend. This is interest. You made a deposit 6 nights ago in the rain, and the Lord's economy runs different than the bank's. This is just the return coming due. By noon, the back payments were settled. A fund the congregation had put together in 3 days, more than enough, with the overflow set quietly aside. Bernice would tell Vesta later, in case the shop ever needed anything else down the road. By 2, the new roof was half done, tin sheets ringing under hammers in a rhythm that hadn't echoed off that house in 30 years. By 4, the sign above the shop, Marsh Radio and Electronics, the paint Odell had touched up himself every 5 years since 1979, had been carefully repainted by a sign maker from the congregation who refused to take a dime for it, the letters crisper and brighter than they'd been since Odell's father painted them the first time. Vesta cried more that day than she had in a decade, standing in her own kitchen surrounded by women she'd never met an hour before, all of them moving through her space like they'd always belonged there. Somebody frying chicken on her stove, somebody else braiding a child's hair at her table, the whole house smelling like Sunday even though it was only Saturday. Odell found a quiet minute that afternoon, slipped away from the noise, and walked into the shop alone. He stood at his workbench, looked at the photograph of his father tacked above it, and said, the way he had every morning for 40 years, morning, pop. Then, quieter, we made it. He didn't tell anyone. Not even Vesta, that he'd gone into the shop that morning, fully expecting it to be the last Saturday he'd ever flipped that sign. Word of what happened on Cobb Lane spread the way these things do now, faster than it ever could have in the old days. A member of the congregation posted photographs of the bus and the roofers, and Odell standing dazed in his driveway. And within a week the story had traveled past the church, past the county, into the kind of places where strangers 1,000 miles away found themselves crying at their kitchen tables over a man they'd never meet. People started driving out to Cobb Lane just to see the shop, to bring Odell radios they didn't even need fixed, just to shake his hand and tell him what the story had meant to them. He fixed every single one anyway. He wouldn't have known how to do otherwise. A year passed. On a humid morning in late October, fog low over the Chattahoochee bottomland, a car Odell didn't recognize turned in off Cobb Lane just past 6 a.m. He was already in the shop, coffee going, a transistor radio from 1962 in pieces on the bench in front of him. Vesta's grits were on at the house, the smell of them drifting out across the gravel the way it had every morning of his life. The car was an old sedan, rust along the wheel wells, steam curling off the hood in the fog. A young man got out, maybe 22, dress shirt too big for him. A tie he clearly didn't know how to knot properly hanging loose at his collar, eyes red-rimmed like he'd been crying or hadn't slept, holding a folded piece of paper in one shaking hand. "Sir, I don't have money for a tow. I've got an interview in Columbus in 2 hours. It's a real one, sir. First real interview I've had in 8 months, please. Is there anything?" Odell held up a hand, the same gentle motion he'd made on a rainy Thursday a year ago to a woman named Bernice he hadn't known yet either. "Pop the hood, son." Vesta appeared in the breezeway doorway, dish towel still in her hand the way it always seemed to be, and took one look at the boy's hollow face. "When's the last time you ate, baby?" He couldn't answer her. She nodded once, the way she always did, like the answer hadn't really been necessary at all. "Come sit at the table. Grits are on. We'll feed you while he works." 35 minutes later the car was running. A cracked serpentine belt, easy enough once you knew where to look, and the young man had eaten 2 helpings of grits and eggs and finished a glass of sweet tea he hadn't asked for. Vesta packed him a foil parcel for the road, the same way she always did now, like it had become a kind of ritual nobody had ever decided on out loud. He tried to leave his watch on the counter, the only thing of value he had on him. Odell pressed something into his hand instead, a business card, Marsh Radio and Electronics on the front, and on the back, in his own crooked handwriting, the words, "You don't owe us a thing. Just pass it on when you can." The boy drove off into the thinning fog, and Odell and Vesta stood together at the edge of the gravel and watched his taillights disappear around the bend. Their granddaughter, Imogen, Marcus's daughter, 17 now, visiting for the long weekend, had been sitting on the porch steps the whole time, watching. She came down to stand beside them. "Granddaddy, Grandma, you didn't even ask him for gas money." Vesta wiped her hands on her apron, looking down the empty road. "Baby, a year ago, near 40 strangers we'd never met drove 2 hours in a church bus to save this place. You think we're gonna charge that boy for a belt and a plate of grits?" Odell just smiled, said nothing, and went back to the radio waiting for him on the bench. The fog burned off by 9. Odell and Vesta sat in the breezeway, the way they had nearly every morning for 42 years now. 2 cups of coffee between them, the new tin roof catching the early light behind them, the repainted sign glowing fresh white and gold over the shop door. Somewhere down Cobb Lane, faint at first and then closer, came the low rolling sound of a church bus engine. Not Mount Zion's this time, just one of the regular Saturday groups that had taken to stopping by on their way through, the way people did now, just to say hello to the man at the end of the lane. Vesta tapped her coffee cup against his. "Morning, old man. Morning, woman who married a fool." 4 doors said no that night, and the 5th said yes, and that's the whole of it. One old black radio man and his wife who didn't flinch at 5 strangers, and a sick child standing soaked on their porch. And somehow that one yes turned into a roof, a sign, a debt paid in full, and a road that strangers still find their way down a year later when their own car runs dry. You have to wonder about the 4 houses that turned those women away first. Whether the people behind those doors ever found out what they walked past that night. Whether the porch lights they shut off still feel as easy to switch off now as they did then. Odell never asked what those 4 households thought of him afterward, and he never once mentioned them to a reporter or a stranger with a camera, not because he'd forgotten, but because some things don't need saying twice once a person already knows the shape of his own heart. Vesta liked to say it simpler than that. She liked to say the whole thing came down to one plain fact. Somebody knocks, you open the door, and you figure out the rest after. Ask yourself the same question Odell never had to ask himself because his hands had already decided before his mind caught up. Would you have opened that door, fifth one down the lane, after 4 had already said no? Tell the truth, not the answer that makes you look good. Somewhere tonight, on some road like Cobb Lane, somebody is still knocking.